Today on the podcast, I'm welcoming back Peter May, a multi-award-winning and best-selling author. Welcome to the podcast.
Delighted to be here, Alan.
Yeah, so nice to see you. I wanted to touch base a little bit about your a book that came out last year for you, and you're probably sick of talking about it, but it's The Lockdown.
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, I'm sick of talking about it. When it first came out last year and it was all over on the news, I remember thinking, wow, Peter really wrote and got that published fast. And then I realized you actually wrote it in 2005. Can you tell us that story? Because it's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, it was one of those things, I was a kind of pivotal point in my writing career where I'd written 6 China thrillers. My publisher had drawn a curtain on that, didn't want any more. I wrote a book called The Black House, which at the time I thought was the best thing I'd ever written, but nobody wanted to publish it. And then I wrote another book called Extraordinary People, which was the first of an intended series about Enzo McLeod, the forensic investigator. And I couldn't get a publisher for that either. And I'd used up 2 years of my life writing without contract, forking out small fortunes to research those books, and no income. And so I was in a really tight spot, and I thought, well, I need to write something fast. I need to write something that is going to sell. So, how about a nice fast-paced thriller that takes place over 24 hours? And I decided to set it in London with a backdrop of a pandemic, a viral pandemic. And I'd done research on this subject for previous books. One of my China books, I'd done a lot of research on the Spanish flu virus. And then for another of the China books, I'd considered writing one of the murder mysteries set in Beijing, set against the backdrop of a pandemic like the SARS pandemic, which had come out in 2002, 2003. But my then publisher didn't like that idea, so I didn't do it. But when it came to this fast-paced thriller, I decided, I was gonna, set it in London rather than Beijing, and it was going to be against the backdrop of a viral pandemic. And I did my research. I asked the scientists at the time, what they thought would be the next pandemic, and the universal consensus was that it was most likely to be bird flu. So that's what I did my research on, and that's what I wrote. I wrote it really fast. From start to finish, from concept through research to storylining to writing the book, it took 6 weeks. I was writing 5,000 words a day. I was burning the midnight oil. My wife was leaving plates of food for me at the door. Because I was desperate, I had to make some money. And lo and behold, when I finished it, I couldn't get a publisher for it. Because the publishers all said, no, this is too far-fetched. It's impossible to believe that, a major capital city like London could be shut down by a virus. 15 years later, they know better. That was the origin of it. And it's interesting to note that those 2 previous books I couldn't get published. The Black House later became my big breakthrough book and has sold millions of copies around the world. And the Enzo Files went on to become, big best-selling series. So, what do publishers know?
That's incredible. It's so interesting. Yeah, it's just crazy. You kind of think, I wonder how many manuscripts are out there that are fantastic that haven't seen the light of day or might never see the light of day.
Well, I'm quite sure there are plenty of them out there, because the people are writing all the time and publishers are rejecting all the time. So it's for sure.
That must have been surreal for you too, that to all of a sudden, you have your book out, and obviously you thought about it because, that's why you wrote it, but was it surreal? Was it creepy for you to see it, like your book kind of come into reality in 2020 and today?
It was weird because I had, to be honest, I'd forgotten about it. I mean, you write these things and you try and sell them and they don't sell. And I'd written maybe another 12 or 14 books in the interim. And so it kind of receded into the dim and distant mists of my memory. And it was actually somebody on my Twitter timeline who suggested that I might like to write a thriller set against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic. And this was last March. And I suddenly thought, wait a minute, I've already done that. Only it wasn't coronavirus, it was bird flu. So I went searching about. I found the original manuscript and I reread it. Now, I mean, obviously I remembered the broad outline of the plot, but the detail of it I didn't really remember. And I was kind of blown away by how close it was to what was actually happening at that point, with the world going into lockdown, everybody wearing masks, social distancing, funerals and weddings banned, public meetings banned, sport cancelled, empty streets. It was just everything that was happening in the world around us, and it was quite spooky. And even spookier was the fact that at the beginning of the book, the Prime Minister gets it and dies. And this was as I was reading it, Boris Johnson got coronavirus, and he was rushed into the emergency room at the local hospital, which is the same hospital in the book that the Prime Minister, the fictitious one, died in. And I'm thinking, God, if he dies, I'm going to get blamed for this.
Yeah, you're gonna have the UK's equivalent to the Secret Service on your door, huh?
Yeah.
Wow, yeah, that must have been just so surreal to see all that playing out. And so, yeah, and then it was interesting too, because I heard you in I think in an interview, or I can't remember where I heard this, but well, first of all, I'm excited that Enzo McLeod is back in your new book, the Night Gate. But that also came kind of because of the pandemic, because you were planning to write a book set in Norway, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, serendipitous. The pandemic is responsible for a lot of things. It was responsible for the publication of Lockdown, and it killed off the book that I'd been intending to write, a book that I'd spent several months developing, researching. I'd booked my research trip to Svalbard, which is an archipelago in the Arctic Circle, right off the extreme north of Norway. And I was really looking forward to that trip, looking forward to writing the book. And obviously, I had to cancel the trip because of the pandemic. And I was left sitting there thinking, well, what am I going to write? Because I still had a contractual obligation to deliver a manuscript before the end of the year. But I couldn't travel for research. My head was spinning at the time. This would be last June, and that was the point. I kind of remembered a blog post that I'd made the previous year following a visit to an exhibition in a local town here in southwest France, where I live. And a place just 5 minutes along the road from me. And it was an exhibition all about the evacuation of the contents of the Louvre during the war, to keep it out of, to protect it against, bombing, and to keep it out of the hands of the Nazis. And I hadn't known anything about this, but everything had been evacuated from the Louvre. It had moved first to the Loire Valley, chateaus there, and then it went further south, and it ended up last couple of years of the war right here, where I live, in a chateau just down the road from me. Most of the paintings from the Louvre were there, including the Mona Lisa. So I was interested, obviously, to go along and see this exhibition. And we were looking at the panels mounted on the walls, and suddenly I see this black and white photograph. And I turned to my wife, I said, "That's our garage." And it was because we own this double garage that has an apartment above it. And just at that point, I was in the process of having it converted into my kind of creative workspace, studio, writing space, etc. That's where I'm sitting talking to you right now. And I thought, well, what on earth is this doing up in this exhibition? So we read the blurb, and it turned out that when they evacuated the paintings from the Louvre, there were these canvases that were just huge. I mean, massive things, and they were too big to transport. So they had to strip them out of their frames, and they rolled the canvases around these long wooden poles for transportation. And when they came down here, they were too long to get through the door of the chateau. They couldn't get them maneuvered in. So they requisitioned my garage, and they fed them through the window here on my right, and they were laid right along the floor here, the full length of the building. And these were world famous, priceless paintings. The Wedding Feast at Cana by Veronese, the David's Coronation of Napoleon, and others. And they were right here. I mean, I even now I get goosebumps thinking about it. You know, I feel as if I'm kind of touching history as I sit here. And it and I did this blog post about it, and I got a phenomenal feedback from readers all going and saying, oh, that's an incredible story. It should be turned into a book. You know, and at the time I couldn't think what on earth the book might be. What would the story be for a book? But last June, when I was sitting looking for an idea for a book, something that I could work on quickly, that came back to me, and I thought, well, people were interested in this. Maybe I can turn it into a story. So that's what I focused on, and lo and behold, it turned into The Night Gate.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I received a copy from your publisher, and it's such a fantastic read, and it spans many generations, and yeah, the whole part of of basically these art people playing cat and mouse games with the Nazis to try to protect these incredible pieces is just mind-boggling. But then it goes all the way to France in 2020, dealing with a lockdown. So it's a fascinating read, and just it's crazy. I didn't realize that that your garage played such a big role in it. That's amazing.
Yeah,
it's goosebumps.
It even appears in the book, you know.
That's your actual.
Yeah. I mean, there was a 24-hour guard on the garage during the war, when the stuff was here, but armed guards. The added benefit of it all to me was that I could set the story right here. I mean, all the contemporary story thread is set where I live, in the village of Karanac, for example, where the murder takes place. It's just across the valley there. I mean, I can drive to it in 5 minutes. It was where I bought my first house in France. It's a place I know really, really well. And, you know, the Chateau de Montal, where the paintings were kept, I've been going there for 40 years. At the town of Saint-Céré with the towers that sit above it, you know, it's my spiritual home. I wrote a book in a cafe in Saint-Céré. So all these locations I knew really well. So it meant I didn't have to travel for the research. And of course, the historical story thread, which is set in the 1940s, well, I couldn't travel for that unless I could have traveled back in time. But I was doing all my research here on the internet. So it just meant that it was a real lockdown book, a pandemic book, in the sense that, you know, I was here in France, they call it confinement. I was confined to quarters, and you know, and this is where I wrote the book. And so, you know, all the elements of it fitted into the fact that I was stuck here.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then, you know, that's something else I wanted to ask you about, because I've been asking all the writers that I've been interviewing here in the past year, and most of them are not touching the COVID-19 or the pandemic in their writing. You took it head on. Did you think about that? Were you worried about that readers might have COVID fatigue? What made you want to tackle that on?
Well, a number of things. I mean, if you're writing two story threads and one of them's historical, that's a fixed point in time, and therefore your contemporary story thread must relate to that. across a fixed period of time. You can't, you can't vary that. You have to be specific. So I had to choose a time when this was taking place, and it couldn't be prior to this period that we're living in now, and it couldn't be in the future. It had to be now, which meant that I had to address the world as it is. And so the story takes place as I was writing it in autumn of 2020. And France was not in lockdown at that particular time, but there were still restrictions. And it went back into lockdown at the end of the month, just going into November. And so actually, as I was writing, I used the fact that the country was going back into lockdown as a kind of pressure point put on Enzo to solve the crime before lockdown meant that he wouldn't be able to travel. And so story-wise, it worked perfectly well. I also think that as contemporary writers, if you're a writer of contemporary fiction, whatever the genre, you have a kind of obligation to reflect the world as it is. And so, I wanted to do that. I didn't want to make a big issue of it. It's not part of the story. It's just background. It's just the fact that people have to wear masks and gel their hands, and that, when you go to the Louvre, they've set up a one-way system so that people are socially distanced and all this kind of stuff. It was just wallpaper, if you like, but it was the wallpaper of our contemporary lives. But the other factor that played into that was the response I'd had to readers from the book Lockdown, because when it first came out, a lot of people said, "I can't read this just now. Maybe I'll read it, when the pandemic's over." But that was a minority. The majority of people said, "I want to read this now," and the feedback I got was that people felt, and this is a weird word, but it was used frequently, a sense of comfort from reading something that was so familiar to them. They're going through this pandemic, and in a sense, realizing that other people are going through something similar makes you feel less isolated. So there's a sense of comfort in it. You're not alone in this. And so I felt, let's reflect that in the writing of The Nightgate, that contemporary story element. It should reflect the lives that people are living and the life that they know.
Yeah, I guess even when the lockdown first started, or the pandemic first started last year, I remember on Netflix those two pandemic movies, Contagion. I can't remember the other one. Both were like top. So yeah, so a lot of people might shy away from it, but a lot of people, like you said, find comfort into it, and that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I guess if you ignore it, then you'd be kind of writing speculative fiction then, right?
Well,
contemporary story.
Well, of course, when I first wrote Lockdown, I was accused of writing science fiction rather than crime fiction. You can't win,
And it had been several years since your last Enzo McLeod book. So I was kind of curious, do you fall right into that character, or does it take you a little bit to get back into that world, or?
Well, it was interesting because, the Enzo books were written from about 2005 to about 2011, something like that. And then there was a kind of, I had a publishing upheaval. I changed publisher in America. I changed publisher in Britain. I got a new publisher in Britain. And the final book had not been written. And I didn't actually write the final Enzo book until, I think, probably about 2017, 2018, thereabouts. And the thing was, though, that there was a timeline in the series, and I couldn't suddenly leap forward 7 or 8 years. So that book was set at, I can't remember exactly which year it was, like 2012, 2013. So after that point, Enzo had resolved all the crimes, the cold cases that he'd set himself to do, and effectively went into retirement. So there was although it was only 2-3 years since I'd actually written the book, it was like 7 or 8 years since Enzo had finished.
Mm.
It's a weird dichotomy, but I was interested to go back to him. I mean, it was because I was under pressure, and I didn't want to start creating a whole new character. The story was set in France, so it made sense for me to resurrect Enzo, and he was a character I knew well and found easy to write for. But it had the additional kind of frisson for me in revisiting the character. I mean, I think he's 65 now in the Nightgate, 65 or 66. He's retired. So it was interesting to kind of explore where he was in his head and his life, and how retirement had affected him. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I really think you're one of my favorite writers, and I think you come up with the best body discovery scenes in books, and in this one, I love this one where someone's been shot in the head and their body's been disinterred by this tree roots. Where do you come up with that? Is that just part of your research? I mean, that is so fantastic.
I don't know. I don't know where that came from. Just I don't know. You come up with ideas. You think. I suppose I think of things quite visually. So I kind of had a mental picture of the fallen tree. The tree comes down in the storm, and the roots come up, and it brings up this body that's been there for skeleton now that's been there for 70 years, and it was a very visual image for me, and I quite liked it. So I built the rest of the kind of detail around that, because you have to explain why it's there and how it's there and how it came to be uprooted and all the rest of it. So, but that's all grist to the mill. That's all the kind of things you're looking for when you're writing a book that gives it flesh and depth.
Yeah, before you were writing your books, you had a very successful career writing for television dramas in the UK. Were you a fan of the crime fiction genre from before? Before you started to write them, why did you choose as a crime fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I'd always read, all the classic crime writers, and enjoyed a good thriller. I always enjoyed a thriller in the cinema. I suppose I never really set out to write in the crime genre. I sometimes describe myself as an accidental crime writer. When I quit TV in the mid-90s to kind of focus on trying to make a living writing books, the first thing that I had come up with was a story that really interested me about genetic engineering and the modification of foods and crops. And I kind of had a story in mind, but the problem was how to tell it. And eventually I came up with this idea that I would tell it through the investigation of a murder. So that the book opens with the discovery of a burning body in a park in Beijing. And so I had to create obviously a cop, and I had to create a pathologist and the relationship between them, and American pathologist, and the whole thing developed from that and became a kind of a crime thriller. And in a sense, once you embark down a genre road, you're kind of stuck in the tram lines of that, because what are genres but marketing, publishers marketing? And the publisher doesn't want you to stray outside the marketing guidelines. You're a crime writer, so we can market you that way, that your name is associated with this genre. Now I've never minded that, because I enjoy crime books, and I also think that the crime genre is one of the widest possible genres you can imagine. You can write about anything, about absolutely anything. And so, I have never felt constrained by it, and I've always enjoyed doing it.
And you're so well, and you talked about your research. You're so well known for your research. You put in a lot of research beforehand. How do you determine what to put in, or do you end up like with a whole bunch of binders of research, or a computer full of info? Just kind of curious about that process.
Well, yeah, I mean, you accumulate far more than you ever use, that's for sure. But I mean, I think my years working as a journalist taught me how to select information to make a story work. And it's no different when you're writing a book. You're looking for the research material that is going to make the narrative work or add authenticity to the background. Yeah, I mean, I have read books where you think, oh gosh, the writer's done a lot of research here, and it shows there's too much. He's used too much. And that's always a danger. It's always a risk, and so it's a balance that you have to strike. I I mean, the research for the Night Gate was huge, and it was under pressure because I had time pressure on me. I had to get writing fast. I had to start writing in September, and I'd only started working on the thing in June, and it so. I did a lot of initial outline research. I developed my storyline. I did a lot of outline research. And then I was able to make up a list of all the detailed research I needed to do. And I I looked at it on the page and thought, I was overwhelmed by it, to be honest. It was, I thought, I can't, there's not time to do all this research. So that's the point at which I prevailed upon my wife, who's also a writer, and said, look, would you do some research for me? Would you be my research assistant? Now, I never do that. I always do it myself, but I trust her. And so I gave her a list of the things I required detailed research done on, and she produced this fabulous document, which it was full of links to web pages, photographs, detailed information on every subject that I was interested in. And I mean, some of these things would be down to, where was the headquarters in Paris of the arts agency that the Nazis set up to steal art? And you discover it's in this particular hotel, and that hotel is actually still there. And it has this fabulous cupola, stained glass thing in the foyer, and you pick up all this kind of detail as you're doing it. Well, she researched into all those different things and found all those for me, and I just had that document on one of my screens. I worked with 3 screens, and I had all my research stuff on one screen, and her document was there. And when I needed detailed information, I could scroll down, look at that, click on a link, go somewhere else, and determine what it is I needed to know to give authenticity to the scene. So I mean, I enjoy research, but this was, the pressure to do this is huge.
Yeah, especially since your mind was set already on that other story. So you're totally switching gears. I can imagine how stressful that must have been without contract deadline looming. It's fantastic, and it's such a great book, and it's coming. The Night Gate's coming out March 18th here in the U.S. So by the time people are watching and listening to this interview, it'll be available. So they have to go get it. It's highly recommended. What are you working on next? What's next for you?
I'm taking a break.
You reserve it, huh?
Yeah, I feel that I deserve it. Last year was a crazy year with the publication of Lockdown and the kind of international phenomenon that became, and the press demands on me for interviews around the world and stuff. It was just crazy. And then the writing of the cancellation of the trip, the writing of the Night Gate, and now with the Night Gate's coming out this week. And last week, Lockdown came out in France, and it's aroused huge interest here. And I've done big interviews for Le Monde and Libération, the 2 major dailies in Paris, and who've carried huge big spreads on it. I've been in television and radio, and it's been kind of crazy because I've been doing the promotion for the Nightgate at the same time. So I'm kind of like, what book am I talking about? What language is this? And my head is totally scrambled at the moment. And I just think I need to just take a step back and take a little while to relax. I'm not going to be able to get to Svalbard this year. That's clear. So the earliest that I can get there would be spring 2022. So it'll be a decision about whether I do make that trip and write that book, or whether it's gone cold on me and I'll want to look for something else. But right now I'm just going to chill.
Yeah, drink some of that good French wine and smell the roses.
Absolutely.
All right, Peter. Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. Really appreciate you coming on.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.